At the end of Parshas Veyeitzei, when Yaakov decides to run away from his father-in-law Lavan, Torah tells us that Yaakov took his children, his sons, and put them on the camel. He took his wives and put them on the camel. And Rashi over there says, we see that Yaakov first took care of the men and then the women. Yaakov was men first, women second. Esav, on the other hand, says Rashi, was woman first and men second. Now, this Rashi seems pretty black and white, that the right way of doing things is to give, to allow men before women. But it doesn't seem so simple in Torah. We see Yaakov himself, later on when he's going to meet his brother Esav, says that it says that he's crossing the river, and first he took his wives and his maidservants, and only then did he take his children. It seems like Yaakov too allowed women before men, following the path of Esav. We see when Yaakov himself asked Lavan, just give me my wives and give me my children. He doesn't say give me my children and then my wives. First he says wives and then children. Again, following the way of Esav, of first putting the women before the men. So which one was it? It doesn't seem so simple that men need to come before women. It seems possible too that this path of Esav isn't so bad, or sometimes it might even be preferred to put women before men. We see this also by Avram Avinu. Usually, who's a proper wife, one who does the will of her husband. And we see by Avram Avinu, when he had an argument with Sarah about kicking Ishmael out of the house, Hashem told Avraham, whatever your wife Sarah tells you, you should follow her. So which one is it? When do we say that we should be men before women? And when do we say that we should be women before men? And the explanation goes as follows. What's the difference between men and women? Men are predominantly, or should be, intellectual, more objective, thought through, thorough, not so impulsive and making impulsive emotional decisions. They're much more calm, cool, and collected, longer-term thinkers, intellectuals, etc. That's the usual stereotype, historical stereotype as a difference of men and women. Women, on the other hand, are much more intuitive, warm, and much more alive emotionally, much more sensitive. So the woman would represent the emotions, and the man would represent the head. Now, which one do we give predominance? Which one do we say, whose pace should we follow? Yaakov, as Rashi tells us, Yaakov first placed the men before the women. In other words, Yaakov, in a time of clarity, when we're aligned properly, the point we should place men before women. In other words, we should place our head before our emotions. Our emotions are subjective, don't always feel the truth, could make us do things that in the short term feel very important, but are not necessarily aligned with what is real. The difference of the mind and the heart is the mind thinks of what's real, independent of how I feel about it. The heart is then how I feel about it. So ideally, the point is the heart, the subjective me, my truth should be aligned with the truth. First, I should try to understand what is true, what is real, what's the right way of living, and then aligning my heart with that. That's in a Yaakov reality, when things are clear and clean. But sometimes we're in a life of Esav, or we're in a time, a Galos, which is like Esav, when things are dark and fuzzy and unclear. And at that point, we can't wait for our mind to have things worked out, for us to engage in what's right. At that point, what comes out when the mind goes numb and fuzzy in a time of Galos, what comes out then is the ability of Mesiras Nefesh, the deep emunah of a Jew, which is rooted in his heart. And in a time of Galos, when we're living in an Esav reality and when we're in the dark, we can't wait for our heart to follow our mind. We need to wait for our heart to precede our mind. Follow what deep down we know is true, even if we can't articulate an intellectual answer and start explaining how exactly does this make sense. I know there's so many different opinions. I know I'm a Jew. I know Torah mitzvahs is true. I know I need to bring other Yidden closer to Torah mitzvahs. How will I integrate that into my... how will I make sense of that? That will come later. But in a time of Galos, we can't slow down the soul to the pace of the mind. We have to pick up the pace of the mind to follow the pace of the soul. And the soul is in the heart. So this Esav way of being is not a bad way of being. In a time of Galos, when things are dark, our brains are asleep. Ani yeshena begalusa. I am sleeping in Galos, but v'libi er, as the pasuk says. Ani yeshena v'libi er. I am sleeping in Galos, the sages say. But when my mind goes to sleep, my heart comes alive. That's why in following this way of living in Galos, of placing our hearts before our head, actually makes the reality when Mashiach comes, we say, Nekeva Teseviv Gever, the woman will come before the man. The woman will be dominant over the man, even though in the time of Galos, usually we say the other way around. Because right before Mashiach comes, the brain's a very confusing place. It's in a confused place. Every day I seem to rethink what's right, what's wrong. There's so many different opinions out there. Where's life going? What's going to be tomorrow with the world? And it's paralyzing sometimes. At that point, we need to know how to silence our brain and just go with what deep down we know is true. Place the woman in front of the man and place what I know emotionally, or what I believe, or what my heart screams, the truth my heart screams, that is going to be more aligned with the truth than my brain, and then my brain will catch up to the heart. This is famous with the Kukuriku story of the the boy who went to Shul on Yom Kippur in the time of the Baal Shem Tov. He didn't know how to daven. He didn't know how to read anything. He knew how to cluck like the chicken, but his heart knew how to daven before his head knew how to daven. He said, I don't know how to read. I don't know what I'm saying, but God, I know you're there, and I know you could hear me. So he clucked like a chicken. And that was what specifically abolished the Gzeira. I'll tell you an interesting Miftzayim story. One time I was putting on tefillin with Jews in 3rd Street Promenade in California, and we had this eccentric handwriting analyst. He might have even been homeless. He was Jewish, and he would put on tefillin with us. One day we saw that there was a missionary that came to talk to him about converting to Christianity, and he was quoting to him this verse from the Testaments and this verse. And we went to him and said, "Knock it off! This guy's a Jew. Stop intimidating him." And he got into a little argument with us, and then he turned to this man and said, "So you, at the end of the day, you're going to go to heaven. If you don't accept our belief, what are you going to go tell God to get into heaven?" He says, "You know what I'm going to tell God?" And he looks at us with a very straight face. He puts out his arm and just said, "Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu lahaniach tefillin." That's what I know. And we put on tefillin with him, and the missionary walked away. If you're waiting for the mind to understand Judaism before engaging, sometimes I could hear this sounds good, this sounds good. This is a case where a man did not necessarily know how to articulate his Judaism. This guy was quoting psukim to him that he didn't have the intellectual ammo to knock off and to tell him how it's untrue and how Judaism is true intellectually. But deep down he knew, when I go to heaven, I will say what I know how to say, and what I know how to say is the bracha on tefillin. In our lives, we need to know and to discern when it's right to follow the way of Yaakov. And obviously, in many decisions, we need to put our brains before our hearts. But our mode of operation in a time of Galos has to be women before men, and our hearts and our beliefs and what we know deep down is true has to precede our brains, and then our brains will catch up too. Have a great Shabbos.